The Story of the Windlenot Museum. Chapter 14. Darkest Depths. Richard Cale blinked his eyes twice, trying to fight off sleep. He needed to stay awake, since falling asleep now was still dangerous in the museum. In his mind, the best thing to do was keep moving and keep thinking. He then stifled a yawn and watched as Michael looked at the organ. He knew his friend said the job would be a 3-person job, and he looked over at the siren statue. "So what do you suggest, Mike?" He watched as his friend didn't look away from the organ and just answered the question. "Richard, I want you to press the button that plays the siren song. It may take several plays before we get it right. Carl, I think you should remain right in this area and watch the room. Right now, I think there are too many hiding places for Exupi in here." He glanced back at the reporter and noticed him nodding in agreement. "Indeed. Besides, I can see the whole room from here. If the door opens up in here, I'll see it." Richard glanced to where Carl was standing and noticed the reporter was right. From the back of the room, it was near impossible to not see every part of the room. As he looked out at the room, he started to ponder where the door would open, knowing it was another of the building's secrets. It had to be in the room, but where would it be? Would the organ raise up, or the sandcastle slide away? Of course, if it was the sandcastle, they would have to face the sand Exupi, and from what he could see, it looked like the castle had a greenish hue to it. He was broken out of his thoughts when Michael said, "Rich, push the button." He shook his head and then pushed the button, hearing the sirens sing their haunting song. As he heard it play, he also heard Michael starting to push shells on the organ. At first, it was obvious it was going to take time, since the notes that Michael played rarely matched the notes the sirens sang. The longer he listened and looked at the statues, in his mind they each started to look like Yvette. He sighed, missing her and her long red hair. Deep down he swore he had an attraction for redheads. Of course, the statues all started to match Yvette's figure as well, and he just wanted to embrace them. He was brought out of his musings when Michael shouted at him, "Richard, push the button again. I think I may be getting closer, but the song stopped." He looked back at the statue and realized the song had ended. He played it again and tried to make sure he didn't daydream again. As the song played again, he heard Carl remark, "Maybe he fell victim to the siren song. He looked like he was really staring at the statues." He could tell by the tone of Carl's voice the older man could sympathize with what he was thinking. Richard just nodded and stifled a yawn. "I did. They just all looked like Yvette for a bit. Made me wish she was here, just so I could hold her. There were a few weekends we stayed up late holding each other and talking." Deep down he wasn't sure if either wondered how far they had gotten, but the truth was they were both content with just casual contact. He then sighed, wondering if the events of tonight might make them take their relationship to another level. As Michael played the organ again, he heard Carl take a few steps back towards him, saying, "I understand what you're going through. I swear if I look at those statues for too long, they look like Louise. She had been a nice gal, a woman I loved, and I miss her too from time to time." Richard wanted to ask what happened to her, but decided not to. After a moment, Richard realized the tune from the organ matched the siren's song, and it made him miss Yvette even more. It also made him realize that when they got out of the museum, he would ask Yvette to go steady with him. It wasn't like they had already, but they might as well. His thoughts ended, however, when he heard a loud sound like a heavy door swinging open. Before he could turn around, he heard Carl say, "Well, I had thought it would be there, but this confirmed it." When he turned, he saw the huge stone face had swung open, which told him the passage they were looking for was right behind it. They all walked over to the entrance that just appeared, and Richard couldn't believe what they were seeing. Behind the stone face had been a stairway down. Instantly, his thoughts were to the film they had all seen earlier in the theater. The fact that the film was waiting in the projector now made complete sense. Before either of the others could say anything, he was already rushing down the steps, almost stumbling when he reached the bottom. He turned the corner just as he heard Michael shout, "Rich, slow down. We don't know what is down there." Richard paid the words no heed as he rushed down to a lit area where he could clearly see was a replica of the door in the movie. Thanks to the rush of excitement, his tiredness was forgotten, and his mind quickly recalled the exact sequence. As he pushed on all the right spots on the door, he heard the others catching up to him. His friend was first to say something. "Rich, are you crazy? You had no idea what was waiting down here. There could have been some of those Exupi waiting for you." He only answered when the door slid open, revealing a bright red room with multiple passages branching from it. He looked at the others and addressed Michael. "Sorry, Mike. I just had a feeling I knew what we would find was the door from the movie, and something tells me that right now the Exupi aren't going to be that big of a threat in here." He glanced back at the room and looked around for a moment, confirming in his mind that this was going to be the last step in finding the room they were looking for. Michael McNeil crossed the threshold into the room and looked around for a moment. As he looked around, he realized that the room wasn't what he was expecting. He had been expecting to see the room with a tar pit in it, like he had seen on the screen they saw earlier. However, that was entirely absent. What they were in was a room with 3 other exits, other than the one they came in through. He looked around for a moment and then said, "So where's the exhibit we saw on the screen?" He watched as Carl walked to one of the exits and looked in a bit. He watched as the reporter looked around before stepping back towards him. "I think it's on the other side of this maze. If this is supposed to act as a portal to a subterranean world, a maze is a good defense." Michael glanced at Richard, who quickly pushed his glasses back on his face and nodded. Michael knew Richard had been foolish to run ahead like he had, but now getting separated might be a dangerous, but only option. He just sighed then and said, "So what do you think is the best course of action? Split up and each take a different path?" He watched as Carl shrugged and then said, "Might work, if we could trust ourselves to stay in shouting distance. However, I don't know if it's wise." He had to agree with Carl, but it might be the only option. However, before he could agree to it, he heard Richard say something that surprised him. "What about the old right-hand rule?" He looked at Richard, a bit surprised, but his friend continued, "It's something my father showed me when we went to one of the giant mazes they built. You place your hand on the right-hand wall, and then walk the maze. It may take longer to solve the maze, but it gets you to the exit. The only downside would be if the final chamber is in the center of the maze." Michael thought about it for a moment and realized what his friend meant. If the final chamber was in the middle, the right-hand rule would take them around it. However, it was a way they could remain together and traverse the maze that they had encountered. He took up a spot in the lead and led the way, keeping his hand on the wall. A few times he could have sworn he heard a woman calling for help, but realized that it was part of the sounds that was being played in the maze, even so many years later. However, at one point Michael froze when what sounded like the voice that spoke in all the rooms started to speak again. You will all die like the others, and your deaths will free more of my brethren into your world to complete the task we were meant to do. Your friends will die. Your loved ones will die. Throughout all of this, he never let anything bother him. But as the voice continued, he felt a wave of fear go through him. One of you will see a whole town die worshipping a demon. You'd do them a favor releasing us now. He wasn't sure what that meant, but he was sure it was linked to his recent college hunting, even though the day he would go was some time away. But the forerunner in his selection was one in a town called Silent Hill. He was broken out of his thoughts when Carl, who was directly behind him, spoke. We can beat that thing. Take this from a man who had faced down vampires, werewolves, zombies, and even the devil himself. We will survive. Those words from the veteran reporter strengthened his resolve to get out of the maze, and made him continue. To be honest to himself, Michael could not think that anything could be worse than what was happening now. His spirit started to lift when he heard a new sound in the background. It was similar to the sounds he heard from the images of lava flows. He started to quicken his pace, being careful not to go too far ahead. Soon, they entered the very room they had seen from the camera. In fact, as they entered, what he saw first was the only place Nixupi could be hiding in the room. Dividing the room into two parts was a huge tar pit, and what made it worse was that it had a greenish glow, and that told Michael what he expected was there. He looked back at Carl and noticed that Richard was also looking at something else in the room. He then looked over at the tar and said, Would you like to do the honors this time, Carl? He was almost amazed as Carl handed him the camera and said, Certainly. In fact, I'm looking a little forward to it. He then watched as Carl held up the completed pot and stepped onto the first rock that led across the tar. He raised the camera as a bubbling tar sound started to come from the area, which told him the oil exupi was about to strike. When he then snapped a picture just as the foul beast rose up and realized what Carl was holding. Carl Kolchak watched as the oil exubi roared and found itself being pulled into the pot he held. As that happened, Carl felt the same sensation he had felt when he captured the cloth exubi. In fact, this time, he felt a bit younger than he was. As the capture finished, Carl could have sworn that in all his time and all his encounters with the supernatural, he never felt this good after being one of them. When the creature was captured, he turned around and noticed a stunned look on Michael's face, as well as seeing the photo coming out of the Polaroid Instamatic. The first time any one of them had seen an exupi, Michael had the same appearance on his face. Of course, this was also because the African-American boy had been attacked by the water exupi. This time, the stunned look was mixed with a good surprised look. He realized what had stunned Michael when the young man said, Carl, you look like you've gotten younger. In fact, your hair looks a little less gray. Carl was stunned by that, and he quickly grabbed the photo and watched it. As it developed, he was surprised to see that Michael's claims were correct. He did appear younger, not drastically younger, but enough to make him feel a little more spry. In fact, it reminded him of a story told to him by a British journalist, but he was a little suspicious of her claims. When he was over the shock, he heard Richard shout, "This is it! The last one!" He glanced over at the young man wearing glasses and saw him turning what had to be the last skull dial. It had been right next to a hideous-looking creature. In fact, by the look of it, it looked more robotic than natural. He walked over and looked at the thing, and then at the plaque on the wall next to the creature. It was nothing he had ever seen before, and doubt he would want to see it again. He then looked at Richard, who had joined them standing there. "Richard, do you have any idea what this thing is?" He watched as the young man walked over to their side and studied the creature. After a few moments, he watched Richard shrug. "Not a clue. Although after seeing the creature, I may want to look it up." Richard then turned to him and said, "You ever encounter something you've never heard of before and then have to look it up?" Carl smiled and nodded. "Many times, Richard, many times. Mind you, those times were some of the scariest. Some of those times even led me to do a little research after the fact. Believe it or not, after my encounter with the Diablero, I did a little more research into the old Native American legends." He then thought back to the incident, remembering that it was Ron Updike's article that made him realize where the creature had been hiding. After all that, and the encounter of the hospital incident, he read up on all the legends, surprised at how many there were. He then looked over at the other side of the tar pit and noticed the altar-like structure and saw the object on it. It brought him fully out of his memories and brought it to the other's attention. He quickly crossed the pit and picked up the object, shouting, "Hey, I found a pot over here. Anyone realize which one it is?" He watched as the two young men crossed and quickly crowded around the altar. He noticed that Richard was gazing at the pot and noticed the markings on it. "If I remember right, this is the markings for sand, which makes this the pot for containing the sand exupi." That made Carl smile, realizing the young man did have the same instincts that made him search for the truth. Before Carl could say anything to the young man, he heard Michael say, "Hey guys, I think I just found a better way out of here. Instead of navigating the maze again, I don't think we want to hear the electric exupi again." Carl had to agree, since he could tell that exupi's last taunt hit Michael very hard. However, as Carl knelt down and looked up the path, he noticed that the light seemed to get dimmer the farther up they went. He stepped back and saw Richard do the same thing. Hearing a sound of concern come from the boy. "Mike, what's the rule in horror movies regarding going into dark areas?" He glanced at Michael, who kept a calm look on his face when he said, "It's the same about going alone, but I'm also thinking that it might be best to go this way. Remember, we took a chance going through the maze. And did you remember the path we took to get through the maze?" He saw the other young man shake his head, and heard Michael mention another point. "Besides, I remember something from the maps we saw. I think there is a passage that leads to the main lobby." After hearing that, the stairwell made some sense, even if the ducking part was a bit inconvenient. He glanced back at the stairwell, and then at the maze entrance, and sighed. "All things considered, it might be best to climb the stairs. Besides, if what Michael says is true, then a button might be made easy to see at the top to open the panel." He then pulled out a small flashlight from the camera bag and took the lead. "Let's go." As they all headed up the steps, Carl was glad he pulled out the flashlight. Once he turned it on, he could see the steps, but not much else. However, as they neared the top, Carl could see a faint line of light, as if it was coming from under a door. He could even see the button right next to it. As he reached out to touch the button, he heard a growl and heard Richard say, "What was that?" He chanced to glance to his left side and saw two glowing eyes. He wasn't sure if it was an exupy or not, but when a glowing mouth started to open, he quickly pushed the button and bolted out the door that had opened. He glanced back to see Michael bolt out a second, quickly followed by Richard. They all quickly got away from the door as it sealed back up. He reached up for a moment to make sure his hat was still there, and then cursed himself, thinking that they should have gotten a picture. But to be honest, he really didn't want to chance himself or the others to get it. However, he was glad about the fact that they now had captured half of the exupy in the museum, and it would not take long to capture the rest, especially since they had been in every room of the museum.